Thanks, Josh. And it's great to introduce Ewan. Although his talk, I think, has been designed to give me a tongue twister. So I'm going to try and call this out. So it's PPP8S, Pinephone, Pocket, and most importantly, pub-ready k8s lab environment for the part-time Kubernetes CK8s student. It sounds like a fascinating talk, so I'm very much looking forward to it. So over to you, Ewan. I know we're a couple of minutes early, but hopefully there'll be some questions along the way as well. So handing over to you.
Great. I'll try and get my screen shared and we'll see how we go. And of course, that's why I'll quit and rejoin. So I'm glad I was on time, right? I'll see you in just a sec.
No worries. Whenever there's technology involved, there's always going to be challenges. So just waiting for Ewan to come back. Don't forget to join us over on Slack. Again, a shout out to some of our workshop sponsors to have a look on k8s.uk.io. There are a number of workshops running through this week from some of our workshop sponsors. There are some, just trying to see if I can find a link to them all, which I'm not going to be able to do, of course.
There are workshops.kcdio.uk.
Cool. We've got some workshops run by... Workshops run by JetStack, by Control Plane, by SUSE, Solo.io, Container Solutions, and SNCC. So really good ones. These aren't sales pitches. These are workshops kind of designed to help you learn something new, kind of get hands-on with this stuff. Some of them are, just a couple of hours investment, and you get access to some free cool kit, and some people can help you out with that. So I love a good hands-on workshop. So go and check those out. Or reach out to any of us on Twitter or wherever if you've got any questions about stuff. Just while we're also still waiting for Ewan to come back, there are some watch parties going on. I know that they're going on at the moment. So hi, folks in Manchester. Also, there's a couple of social events attached to these. We've got the pub quiz later on, being hosted out of Cardiff, which promises to be lots and lots of fun. So please do stick around for the pub quiz later on today. And I think there's a couple of social events happening around some of the different meetup locations. So if you're already connected to the meetups on meetup.com, they'll be talking about what they're doing, where they're doing it, and how to get joined. I'll be heading into centre of Birmingham, which is a novelty for me because I don't think I've travelled for a while. So I'll be heading into centre of Birmingham to have a look into that. Someone's asking to post the workshop links. Well, we'll get Ewan set up and I'll post the workshop links into YouTube in a second. Thank you for the request.
And I guess, again, we'd like to shout out our sponsors real quick. Again, while we wait for Ewan to come back. Our tech sponsor today that is helping us with the live stream is Tramshed Tech. And we've also got SNCC, Control Plane, JetStack, Sysdig, and StorageOS, who have all been instrumental in making this day possible. So thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. We wouldn't be able to do this sort of things without those supporters. So please do give them a bit of love and attention, especially the Tramshed folks, because without this, we wouldn't be live. So, how are you getting on, Ewan? Great to see you back. You managed to sort your problems.
I think we're getting there, and cool. Hopefully that brings us into the presentation. I hope.
Absolutely, I can see
some of this stuff.
Over to you.
Cool. All right, so apologies for the tongue twister. That wasn't quite the intent of the title, though it's good to get some added bonuses along the way, right? So what I'm going to talk about today is some experiences I had basically going through CKA, CKAD exams, and also trying to be a bit more mobile, a bit more portable with how I do that, not being chained to the desk or to a laptop somewhere. And a topic or a question that often comes up fairly promptly after suggesting this is this question or a variation of it, right? So I thought about it. I went back and looked at sort of how I got here, and it's probably worth taking us through a bit of a history of what's going on. So like many things, this all started as a rather stupid discussion over beers as a works drink somewhere or other. back in 2020 Q1. Not that long afterwards, we have this this small pandemic that a few of us are familiar with breaks out, and that eventually leads into me having my first staycation. So I got all the buzzwords. So my first COVID staycation, and I ended up using that week for really my own sanity. I'd pretty much had enough of COVID and lockdowns around Q3 last year. And so spent a week having a look at how to get Kubernetes running on top of Android on a stock phone. I'm not going to go into much of that today. If people are interested to search for it, there's a presentation somewhere else on YouTube. I think it's London Infrastructure as Code channel. If you search for the K8s on Android and or my name, there's probably going to bring that up. And so I got to present that. And one of the questions that came out of that session was, what would it take to run Kubernetes natively on a phone? And that was an interesting one. I sort of took that away, churned it over in the back of my head. Didn't really think too much about it for a while, and then became aware of this thing called the Pinephone, or I guess Pine 64, and particularly the Pinephone, which is a mobile phone running Linux. So I got one of those delivered. And not too long after I got that delivered, we find ourselves, at least in London, I think most of the UK, back in lockdown through January. And so after various sort of lab explorations, some of those with the Pinephone and some of them not, I managed to get through the CKA and CKAD exams. So I guess a selling point for this talk is you might learn something possibly that will help you with that. Certainly it'll give you a novel way to do it. A bit later through the year, because I started to get interested in now sort of Linux running natively on phones, I ended up with a OnePlus 6T. Q2 and Q3, there were sort of various continuances of this sort of exploration. And obviously in Q3, we find ourselves here today. Another question I get is, why am I hating on Raspberry Pi? What's so wrong about Raspberry Pi? And the honest answer is there's nothing wrong with Raspberry Pi, right? I mean, the portability is perhaps not quite as good as having a mobile phone, but there's a lot of great things about Raspberry Pi. If you really want to take a Raspberry Pi to a pub, plug it into a USB power board, you can do that. I think the main reason for me not exploring that much more was I was already aware of other people that have done, frankly, some fairly cool stuff. An example here is a Twitter link to somebody who's sort of come up with a k8s Raspberry Pi set of nodes and a cluster that sort of you can take anywhere. Maybe not something I want to put on the bar with my pints, but there's already prior art here, and so I just decided, look, let's not go competing with people that are doing really cool stuff. Let's go and try and look at something a little bit interesting and a little bit different. So that's really the only reason not to use Raspberry Pi here. Another question is, why not K3s? This comes up quite a bit. Obviously, K3s being a lighter version of Kubernetes. But again, the way, at least in my mind, that I've justified some of the time I've spent on this is being exam prep. And so really, again, that's why my focus has been around K8s and Linux. So moving on to these devices, PineWatt. So it's probably fairly well known, sort of out there now, but back when I first sort of caught onto it, I was having to explain this a lot more. It's basically a give or take $200 USD mobile phone that runs Linux natively, fairly small sort of, I guess, RAM footprint or capability, and depending on which version you get, fairly small sort of built-in storage as well. SD cards mean that you can expand that, and whichever version of the Pinephone you get today, you can expand sort of your storage with that. For what I've been working with, I guess if somebody is inspired after seeing this and thinks, gee, I want to go out and play with this, look at this stuff, the convergence package is the one I've been using, which is the 3 gig version. both of these currently ship with Manjaro, but it's easy to acquire and fairly easy to install a different distro, and there's varying sort of coverage of distros now on Pinephone for most of the sort of major ones out there. Another piece of hardware that came along in the day or along the days was the OnePlus 6T. So having sort of explored a bit around Pinephone and started to look at what was possible. The Mobian project, which we'll come on to shortly, announced in collaboration with some of the OneMarkOS. Basically, there was a working kernel that meant you could boot to Linux on the OnePlus 6T, and the nice thing about this device is the Pinephone is really great. It's a really nice sort of device and project to play with, but the OnePlus is newer hardware, so it's a newer system on a chip. It's got a bit more RAM, it's got a bit more storage built in. Downsides of no SD card, but there's enough to play around and experiment with. Another sort of small downside, I guess, is that depending on your familiarity with building Android and getting that onto devices, there's a bit more to sort of mentally manage and understand in terms of the build process for that. So the lab, what does this lab look like? To give you a bit of it's a nicer sort of presentation to do face to face and be able to have people sort of come and say, okay, well let's look at this, look at how this works. But just to give you a bit of a taster for it, really we're talking about 3 phones. That top phone there, as it says, there's nothing special about that Samsung device. It's a pure stock Android device. The only thing it's really doing is providing an internet gateway and a Wi-Fi network for the other phones to connect to. And I went that way mostly just for sort of interchangeability and portability. It's trying to make this modular, trying to make it something that's easy to not be carrying lots of stuff around. And then the other 2 devices on here are just the OnePlus that we spoke about, and also the Pinephone. As I think we spoke about before, so at the moment, Pine have decided that they're shipping all Pinephones with Manjaro, and Manjaro's Arch-based. Now K8s has been packaged. I went back and checked. It looks like sort of mid-December K8s got packaged for Manjaro. But what I was seeing when studying and certainly trying to do exam prep was that really a lot of the other materials are Debian based, and so I was trying to align myself with what was going to work well for the exam. Also, looking at getting Mobian running and seeing what that meant. What did it really mean to run some flavor of Debian on the phone? Did it really work? Was it real? That was where I was sort of interested in looking. So again, depending on what folks want to do, there are easier paths to probably achieve some of the things from an exam prep or even just a study, even just a toy perspective. But this is the path I went and why. And again, as we said, after I sort of started down this path, the OnePlus was supported by PostmarketOS, and as a result of that, Mobian as well. And these days, like I say, pretty much all of the distros are available in some shape or form. Obviously, if you start to change or install operating systems on phones, you're getting into flashing the onboard eMMC or an SD card where the phone supports it. Just a few notes here about how I went about that. I've typically left the stock operating system, or at least I've intended to leave the stock operating system in place on the device, and then sort of flash an image that I want to experiment with or work with onto the SD card. The theory, at least coming into this, was that it would be a completely self-sufficient device that could, you could run Linux, do everything you needed to, flash different operating systems, and so that's another reason I went down that road. How you set yours up if you chose to go that way is really, I guess, comes down to how much of a toy is the device you sort of use for it? Do you really care about performance? Because let's face it, you could possibly sort of tune this setup, but that's not really the performance isn't really a major factor that I've considered as I've been working with this for my needs. And again, how useful is it to be able to rewrite the SD card without needing either another computer, whether it's a Linux, Mac, Windows, whatever machine? Can you self-serve yourself out of things using just the phone, or do you actually still need a PC at some stage in the life cycle? And I guess to summarize some of the gotchas, so these are ARM devices, right? So any sort of challenges that you face anywhere on ARM, if you face them on ARM somewhere else, you're going to face them here. Just again a novelty one, because it was something I was kicking the tires on. Things like doing an k8s distro build isn't possible at the moment, or at least wasn't possible a few months back. Using purely ARM, you've got to basically build some of that stuff on Intel and then move it across. Resource constraints, again, particularly the Pinephone. I mean, neither phone is a supercomputer, but particularly the Pinephone has sort of, I guess, an older system on a chip, so it's a reasonably old processor or set of processor cores, and RAM is particularly constrained. I guess sort of 3 gig on the higher spec Pinephone is the limit of where you're going to go. As we sort of move into the Mobian or the operating system side of things, Mobian's got a few quirks at the moment where there are certain things they do with their kernel, which means if you want to run Docker, for example, and in fact, if you want to get CNIs running properly or at all, you end up having to recompile the kernel for various either kernel flags that aren't in there, or in the case of the CNIs, this was an interesting learning for me. I hadn't stumbled across anywhere else, but if you're building custom kernels, make sure you've got the naming standards correct, because it seems at least the 2 CNIs that I tried are expecting a certain standard and just won't run if they find a kernel with a different naming. And then the biggest one, I guess, as well, is that it's amusing to build a Linux kernel on a mobile phone. It's amusing as long as you can put the device down, walk away, and ignore it, because let's say it takes a number of hours, and so particularly where I've been working with the OnePlus, for the most part, I've sort of cheated, right, and cross-compiled, because I just wanted to get stuff done in a relatively timely manner, particularly as you're exploring and sort of finding you need to rebuild kernels a few times because of various settings. It starts to get a little bit tedious. And another one here is the temperature or thermal management. This device can run quite hot if you leave it compiling for a while. I have actually picked it up and thought, do I really want to walk away and leave that somewhere, and with the temperature it's getting to, have I got the right insurance for my house at this point, or do I want to do something else? So it's definitely something, if only from a safety point of view, to just keep in mind. So just coming back into Pinephone, and some of the things, in case folks are thinking on looking at this, one of the things I went into this thinking was, can I make this a daily driver? It'd be really nice to have a native Linux device, no sort of third-party things on there, no sort of Google Play or things like that. Can I run just a pure Linux device? And personally, I've reached a conclusion that not yet. It's a really, really great project. I think there's a lot of really cool work been going on, and still is going on, and there's a lot of things going on to help get Linux into this and other mobile devices. But personally, there's just a few, and they're quite small sort of things that I think can be ignored depending on what you're doing with it. But from a daily driver point of view, just sort of silly little things like the USB connector isn't the greatest the greatest solution. The port tends to, for most of the either cables or docks that I've got, doesn't connect very well. Charging the battery doesn't work very well when you're docked. So for the purposes of, I guess, sitting in the pub, that's not too big a deal, right? If you take the device out, you use it, and then you charge it when you're back home. But if you try to do anything sort of with the convergence mode, then that's you start to run into sort of annoyances. And lastly, just as a simple thing, one of the ways I have used these devices is to go and sit somewhere. I've got a spare, I don't know, anywhere between 5 and 35 minutes where I'm somewhere away from my computer or away from my desk. I want to just go and explore something, read up about something, experiment with it. Some of my experiences with the web browsers on Pinephone has just been a little bit less than I've managed to sort of work around. Actually, if there are any folks that do know better and think they've got a nice setup, particularly on Mobian, I'd definitely be interested to hear from folks on that. So if you wanted to go this way, which device would you choose? And of course, right, it's an it depends answer. Nobody ever gives you a straight answer these days, and I'm certainly not going to break the mold with that today. So depending on whether you're looking at costs, depending on whether you're looking at, small things for a phone, like does phone calling actually work? It really depends which way you would go. My sort of overarching theory is that if you're familiar with Linux, you'd like a Linux device, particularly with Kubernetes to experiment with. I'd probably go down the path of the Pinephone, just because there's a few less moving parts when getting things set up, getting things built. If you're fully familiar with sort of, I guess, Android development, and by Android development, I guess I'm talking about Android operating system development and evolution, and you're happily flashing phones as and when, then probably these things don't matter. For me, coming to this as the real purpose is I want to study. I want to learn Kubernetes internals, or better learn Kubernetes internals and things like that. The sort of barrier to entry on Pinephone was a bit lower, I felt. And yeah, I mean, theoretically, you could use the Pinephone as your only device, and run your Kubernetes cluster, connect it to a screen if you really wanted to, and sort of browse what you're reading, what you're studying, that sort of thing on one device. So, are we pub ready? I'm not going to do a demo today. I was intending to, but we're here where we are. So what I've got is just, I guess, a bit of a teaser for you around around getting this working. As we see on the left, getting Docker working with the necessary prerequisites, so that we can then get interesting that the previous presenter was talking about Cilium as well. So if you want an environment to practice your Cilium configs on, then definitely this is something that you could at least experiment with. And that's all I'm going to run through today. I thought, because I'm not doing a demo, the best thing to do is really sort of whiz through here, share some of the highlights and learnings that I've had along the way, and just open things up to questions as to if people are interested, they'd like to know more, and go from there.
If anyone, thanks for that, Ewan. That's awesome. It's a really interesting project. If there's anyone's got any questions, feel free to either ask in YouTube. I'm pointing at my screen, which I know you can't see. YouTube over there, Slack over there. Feel free to ask a question either location. If we don't get a chance to get to it live now, I'm sure Ewan will be around later on, either on Slack or on Twitter or wherever. I mean, that's fascinating. I guess a question for me: were you using Bluetooth devices to help with that, or were you using the little screen to do all your keyboard inputs and so on?
So generally speaking, I've not used any Bluetooth devices at all. However, I guess one of the key points about the convergence model of the Pinephone is that it comes with a dock, which means you can connect as it happens, a Raspberry Pi keyboard and a Raspberry Pi mouse. And you've then got the choice of, is your eyesight good enough and you want to use that tiny little screen, or are you actually just going to connect it up to a real screen where you can see what's going on and get things done? I think for me, a lot of the usage has been, I typically find myself with a little bit of downtime and I suddenly think, what about X? And it's really nice to just go, oh, I've got this thing in my pocket and I can not go and look at the manual. I can go and execute the command, and within certain boundaries, it will run or it won't, and it will tell me what the output was and why I got it wrong. And that's when I've put up with the little keyboard, because that's fun, right? It's a nice novelty. It's quite amusing, but the second or third minute of that gets a little bit frustrating as you go along.
Sure, I can imagine. And I guess that probably answers my question. I was going to ask about battery life as well, but I guess if you're getting frustrated after 15, 20 minutes, then battery life probably isn't too much of a concern.
Yeah, so interestingly, the convergence mode, and if folks want to go and look at it, there's various sort of articles about why it is the way it is, but the convergence mode prevents fast charging. So it's actually, if you're using the dock, that's when the battery drain starts to happen. And it, depending on what you're doing, you can mostly keep sort of a steady state of battery. But I think the challenge for most people, at least for me, is when you're docked somewhere, you expect it's charging because you expect it to then walk away and work. And when you get a different experience, it's just a bit, you've got to factor that in if you were doing a lot with it as a sort of a novelty device, and something you use remotely and don't necessarily sit and use docks. It charges perfectly fine and works really well.
Cool, awesome.
Right,
thank you very much for that, Ewan. I know we're about 10 minutes early, but on the flip side to that, we get to go to lunch. So we're breaking for lunch now for just over an hour. So we'll be back at 1:50 when we're going to hear from STEMets, from Florian from STEMets. Please do come join that, because STEMets is a fantastic charity doing a lot of work for underrepresented individuals in our community and wider. So it's not just technology, it's also science and so on, maths and others. That's what STEM stands for. So please do come back for track one. We'll be doing the talk from STEMets will be track one, and then we'll split again at 2:00 for track one and track two. We'll hear from Andrew Martin talking about who's afraid of the big bad supply chain. And on track two, we talking a guide to evaluating dependency updates to Kubernetes from Ash Sharma. So enjoy your lunch. Any questions at all for anyone, please come interact with us on the CNCF Slack. We're looking forward to. So
the Slack address, just as a reminder for everyone, is slack.cncf.io. And again, if you are interested in attending any of the workshops coming up the rest of the week, head over to workshops.kcduk.io/workshops. And on that note, we will break for lunch, and we'll see you in a bit over an hour.
Enjoy your lunch.